Welcome to Business Talk. By all accounts, tax disputes are rising as SARS looks to restore itself after years of state capture, and one must always be mindful of the pendulum swinging too far. Equally, SARS has been boosted by better than expected tax takes over the last 2 years thanks to booming commodities prices, which is certainly good news for the fiscus. And one can only hope that we might see some personal income tax relief in next year's budget. But maybe I'm being a little bit too hopeful there. To talk about the brass tacks of tax, I'm joined now by Hannes van den Berg, who's Chief Executive Officer at Momentum Consults. Hannes, welcome to the show. When we look at it, SARS has really attempted to improve its tax collection strategy, and I think rightfully so after the state capture period. How has it done this, firstly? And then secondly, how effective do you think this drive has been so far?
Yeah, thank you, Michael, and thanks for hosting me on your show. Yeah, I think looking back over the last 2 years, as you mentioned in your introduction, we've seen a much better tax collection than budgeted from SARS, supported by Treasury. Which was largely driven by very strong commodity cycle and the weaker than expected rand for us here in South Africa. I think it is mentioned in the previous budget speech, the creation of the so-called new high net worth unit within SARS in 2001 is a clear indication that SARS really wants to plug those holes that they believe there's still opportunity to earn further revenue. I think that linked to the already established large corporate unit that focus on the listed corporate entities, especially those that's also listed on the JSE, is a clear signal of SARS clamping down on any tax leakage in the system. Of late, and we've seen it, and I've as also a part-time tax practitioner for the auto-assessment process from SARS for tax individuals. And I think that was largely driven by first of all, a client experience, which I can commend SARS on, but also to quickly either put out an assessment for people to settle their debt with SARS as soon as possible, or to settle in, obviously, a payment to client. I do believe the 40-day period is a little bit short following the auto-assessment, but that's all signals of SARS trying to increase their revenue pot. Of late, and I follow the Special Investigating Unit on Twitter, a lot of action in that space, a lot of arrests, and a lot of them also linked to either VAT fraud or income tax fraud or income tax not declared. So it seems to me in general, despite our feeling of negativity, that there's real effort from Mr. Kieswetter and team to up the revenue sources for Treasury.
And that, to me, is really encouraging to hear, because I don't think citizens mind paying their fair share over to Caesar, provided that SARS is actually going after all of that money that was gained illicitly through the state capture years. And it's encouraging to see that this particular lever is being pulled effectively. What concerns me, though, Hannes, and it's just anecdotal, is this erosion of the tax base from a high net worth perspective, because many of my friends in my immediate circle, and we would consider ourselves fairly privileged, sort of Johannesburg, northern suburbs, are immigrating, have said, that last power outage was the final straw. How much of this is a concern for SARS, immigration, and the threat of immigration to South Africa's tax base?
Well, I think it's a well-known factor that we've got a very, very disproportionate amount of individuals paying ultimately the tax bill in South Africa. And it is a concern for government and for Treasury. In the report newspaper of April 2022, mention was made of about 1 million people that have immigrated over the last 5 years. In our own company, we can, over the last year, following the so-called great resignation process, a lot of our IT resources and data analysts is migrating to the Netherlands, and most of them is quite young and newly qualified. And it seems to me that, yeah, here between the age 30 and 40, there's a lot of people considering to migrate. There was another article published, I think, last week, say that 53% of graduates and 43% of people earning more than 240,000 rand a year at this stage is contemplating or considering at least immigration. So yeah, I think there's the concentration risk for SARS on the top end of the scales is a concern, and we will need to spread the tax base in South Africa wider. On the one hand, we need to deal with unemployment because the sooner we can solve for the high levels of unemployment, the better revenue there will be for the fiscus, and then obviously we need to stop the leakage. What is interesting. Also, according to Brand Map research here in June this year, that over the last year, 60,000 new millionaires were created in South Africa. So it seems to me there are pockets of industries that is getting it right and individuals that is getting it right. But I think overall, we still sit with a very small amount of people carrying the burden of the tax bill in South Africa.
Yeah, that's the bottom line. I think that's the horns of the dilemma here, because while you want to increase revenue, and it's often easier to go after the big targets with bullseyes on their backs, while people are immigrating, you risk perhaps becoming a little bit too aggressive and pushing a little bit too hard. And people say, well, either we're going to financially immigrate or we're actually physically going to immigrate as well. And both of those are serious risks to the tax base, as you pointed out. And yeah, we're having this debate against the backdrop of the cabinet the cabinet meeting recently, the finance minister saying, well, some kind of basic income grant is being considered. We know at the February budget that there was a task team put in place to go and investigate whether or not we can afford this. I just don't see how we can. Yet there is all of this poverty around us. So you can't let people starve at the end of the day. It really is a difficult challenge.
Yeah, I think there's, for me, also two schools of thought. During the budget speech earlier this year, I was quoted saying that the government is creating a dependency on its voters with grants as opposed to it creating meaningful job opportunities through collaboration with the private sector. Listening to Dr. Rudolf Botha at our recent conference of Consult by Momentum, he's a great prophet of the benefit of a basic income grant and what it can contribute to society, given the high levels of unemployment and poverty in South Africa. I think for us, that from a social perspective, it makes sense, and a responsibility perspective. However, I think South Africa at large, running a big budget deficit already, will need to find a solution how to fund that. Obviously, the increase in the VAT rates was an consideration in the budget speech, which the Minister of Finance didn't opt for. But it is something that I think government will need to solve in terms of how do we fund the basic income grant. And I think before we don't see a massive increase in our growth rate in South Africa, it's something that's going to be with us.
Yeah, but you can also reconfigure the social grant system and have a look at where potentially it's not optimized. For example, the child support grant and whether or not there aren't perverse incentives built in versus saying taking that away and then providing some form of blanket coverage similar to the social relief of distress. And then at least it's a little bit more targeted. You've got to prove that you're unemployed and you can't find work. What do you see as the other economic concerns that affect tax collection in South Africa?
Yeah, I think most of them is, I think, more deeply seated in the way that we run the economy in South Africa, as opposed to pure tax leakage. As one of the greater exporters of commodities in South Africa, I mean that is one element of our economy that we will need to optimize to its full potential. In that, given the weaker rand as we speak, touching on 18 rand, it's a massive opportunity. However, infrastructure-wise, our harbours cannot at this stage cope the demand, either from the agricultural sector or from the commodity sector. So I think if we can boost the system in the economy, we will see revenue picking up in the companies, and we'll see a bigger tax bill for SARS. I think closer in terms of the latest news, always the illegal mining. I think there's some serious leakage in terms of tax, seeing the amount of cash floating around. And then secondly, also a bit mention is made about illegal cigarettes. There was an article out the other day. It's like 50%. It's someone that they doctored on that 50% of all cigarette sales in South Africa is illegal, and that amounts to about 20 rand per package. It's about a 14 billion revenue loss for SARS. So there's something that I think one needs to clamp down on. I don't think that the money lost through corruption always sees the effect of tax as well. I believe there's pressure in the system from that. Obviously, there are extremely high levels of unemployment. If we can get people employed, they got money to spend, so there's VAT collection, there's some tax collection as well. And that's probably the biggest thing on concern for us in South Africa is the levels of unemployment. Yeah, I think import-wise, we do import a lot of things, but from an export perspective, we've got everything set up for great export, but we need the infrastructure, which includes obviously the rebuild of our railway infrastructure in South Africa as well.
And, railways, network industries, I think, feature heavily in the reform agenda of this administration. We're just moving far too slowly. We've started to move on the energy side, even though, yes, we're mired in stage 6 load shedding. I think many of the reforms, which will take 12 to 24 months to bear fruit, are currently being enacted. In the rail side, we've had third-party access announced. But then, Transnet Freight Rail came to the market and said, well, you can only have concessions for 2 years. Now, if you're going to go and borrow 200 million rand from the bank, you need more than 2 years. So there's still some antipathy towards the private sector, and we cannot get over that fast enough to reap the benefits. And that is increased tax revenue, growing economy, more people employed. One just can't understand why would anyone would be against that. I suppose one sometimes needs to follow the money there. When you look at confidence, though, and I think much of where we find ourselves is due to a lack of confidence, how can SARS improve taxpayer confidence?
Well, I think confidence should be created first by government, and it's in a way that the money that we do pay gets spent. That will create the confidence, I believe. I think SARS is the arm to collect it, but government is the one that spends it. And I think through wisely spending, one will create confidence in the market. And looking at our local municipalities, and it's something that I've been trying to break down to its lowest function, and what is the real role of a local municipality or a local metro. And I've reduced it to 5 things. So the one is, I think we all want to have clean water that's drinkable in our households. We want grey water to be taken away. We want electricity supply, refuge removal, a road to travel on, and you want to feel safe. And I think we need to get back to those basic elements in society and in our local municipalities. And those things will create confidence in government, which will take the pressure off SARS in terms of them trying to make it work. Because if people can feel the impact of government and see the impact of government, I don't think it's got a problem to pay the necessary taxes. And added to that is a great health or a good health system that we need in South Africa, given the news of all the public hospitals collapsing. So those are the elements that I think we need to work on. We've already seen through e-tolls a tax revolt. I don't think we sometimes recognize it, but that is society voting against government from a tax revolt perspective, and perhaps it was an easier one to vote against. But we on the brink where I think taxpayers in the country is seriously considering what are they getting back for the amount of tax that they pay. Moving over to SARS itself, I think SARS needs to become an employer of choice. People must go there because they want to work there. So Mr. Kieswetter and team should create an environment where people want to work. That includes knowledgeable people working at SARS. They need to be more clever than the opportunities on the outside. I think a strong investigation unit, which they've started, or units supported by a very strong legal system in South Africa for those that dodge their accountability for tax. And then I think the total process or system should work for revenue to be successful, and that talks to all spheres of government. Every government department should run a proper system and processes as every corporate should, and I think all those things will contribute to a much better and effective treasury, which ultimately will secure the revenue for the country.
Yeah, it is a long-run project, that especially rebuilding the capacity inside an institution that was, from a cultural perspective, was so hollowed out, and you lost so much talent. There was a large business unit that was doing a really good job, very smart, very intelligent, forensic types auditing and tax skills that you lose, and very difficult to rebuild that after these years of hollowing out. But to your earlier point, I think it would be churlish not to commend Mr. Kieswetter for giving it the old college try. And, he would know, having spent time in the private sector, Alex Forbes and elsewhere, that this is what you have to do if you want to build a world-class organization. Just as a concluding question, how's your crystal ball looking, Hannes? What is your prediction for the future of tax collection in South Africa?
I think we should expect that the easy targets will still be the focus. And if I say easy targets, it will be individuals that's employed. And that is the easiest target for tax collection, and likewise corporates through corporate tax and tax on dividends. I think we will need to get the economy going in order to increase the tax base in South Africa. That is very, very important. So I cannot underestimate or emphasize the importance of partnership between government and the private sector to really boost employment. If I look in a post-COVID environment, just the results that came out over the last 2-3 weeks, it seems to me that earnings are normalized to pre-COVID levels for most corporates in South Africa, which is encouraging. It seems to me that we passed the 2020 and 21 horror story, which will come through in much higher tax as normalized earnings increase, and then also as dividends declared by corporates, which I believe is back also to pre-COVID levels, and in some instances actually better, or special dividends being declared, which will all feed the tax system, either through a dividend withholding tax, or even the way that individuals receiving dividends are spending that through it again through the VAT system. So crystal ball, I think we're going to see a good year from a revenue perspective for Treasury. However, I think we're all looking forward to an ANC conference at the end of the year. Will really give us an indication what to expect in the elections next year, which will hopefully give us a lot of hope from economic perspective and economic growth perspective for South Africa.
Yeah, I mean, another 5 years of the reform agenda that has seemed to drag at a snail's pace, but has moved forward. I mean, if you take people back 7 years, we were in an entirely different set of circumstances altogether. So I think that elective conference is going to be a big flag for a lot of people. Hannes, great pleasure chatting to you. Hannes van der Berg, Chief Executive Officer at Momentum Consult, kicking the tax bricks with us here on Business Talk. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. It was a pleasure.